Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this Wednesday night's Bible study. Now, on Wednesday nights, we have been taking the opportunity to study out of a book called Periods of the Old Testament. Now, this is volume 4, and it's focusing on the United Kingdom. Now, it is really hard to go from a Bible class setting where you are answering questions and, going, all right, what's the question number 1? What's the question number 2? And what are your answers, to doing a video like this. And luckily for us, we ended our last class finishing the book of 2 Samuel. So tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to give you an introduction to 1 Kings. And we're going to look at 1 Kings. We're going to look at the context. We're going to look at pretty much everything we need to know about 1 Kings. And then we're going to start this study by going through and reading the chapters. We'll read chapter 1 and we'll go through and we'll break it down and we'll study it and learn what we can, but we're not actually going to answer the questions in the workbook. Now, if you do have a workbook and you're following along with us, I encourage you to take the opportunity outside of this class to fill in the answers. You will have all your questions answered because we will be going through the text. Now, before we actually get into the introduction, you're on your computer, you're on your smartphone, you are looking at the internet right now. So it would be convenient, and this is a convenient time for me to go ahead and recommend 2 different videos that I really think will help promote your understanding of this particular book. There is a lot here to learn when we start talking about the United Kingdom, and we've looked at that for the last several weeks. But we're fixing to start getting into the divided kingdom. And 1 Kings and 2 Kings, because you have to really take these 2 together, they really focus on what divided the kingdom of Israel into 2 unique kingdoms, and also discusses the conquest and what happens to Israel after their failure to follow after God. Now, these 2 videos that I would like to recommend, the first is by a group known as the Bible Project, and they have an excellent introduction to the book. And the second one is by the World Video Bible School, and this is an overview of book 1, 1st and 2nd Kings. And again, they are just a wonderful group who does excellent videos on a variety of subjects. I highly recommend them, and I encourage you to take the opportunity to watch these 2 videos. I will go ahead and put the link to these videos in the comments and in the description so that you have the opportunity to click on those and follow them and watch them as well. So, beginning the book, 2 Samuel ends with David basically at his lowest point. He gives his last order, really, that we see as a king being, go and number the people. And he, we see this and we're like, why, David? Why are you doing something that God directly condemns you for? Why are you doing something that God says don't do? Don't trust in your own armies. Don't trust in, all these other things. Put your trust in me. And this follows David having to, take his kingdom back from his own son. We've seen the variety of issues that David faces. And, David, it really shows us ending 2 Samuel with David being a broken man. And 1 Kings continues that. In fact, it makes sense that it does, because 1 Kings is a continuation of the history. When you look at the Septuagint, what you actually find is that they have 4 books. They call it 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. And it is a study of the kings of Israel and Judah. So they actually combine these. And when you look at the Hebrew, the general, just the original Hebrew, you see that Samuel is the collection of those first 2 books, and Kings is the collection of the second 2 books. So even in the Hebrew, the divisions that we have, that they're not there. So we look at this text and we see that it starts with David being said he is an old man and he can't get warm, and he can't get comfort, basically letting us know that David is near the end of his life. So what is it about 1 Kings? What is this book going to show us? Why do we study it? 1 Kings is going to be about Solomon. In fact, there is 22 chapters. The first 11 of those chapters deals with Solomon, and a lot of it's good. In fact, you have the first 2 chapters, and we'll go ahead and give you the division up here. The first 2 chapters, you have David giving the kingdom to Solomon, and there's some scandal and some things that have to take place there first. But David is giving the kingdom to Solomon, and then we see that Solomon starts off really good, and in chapter 3, he asks God for wisdom. He says, hey, God, I need help. I'm not my father. I'm not able to guide and direct this great kingdom that you've blessed me with. And he says, can you please help me with that? Can you give me the wisdom? And God says, that's exactly what I want. I want someone who acknowledges that, who asks me, who humbles himself. So we see that Solomon is the key focus here. After that, he builds the temple, which is what David wanted him to do, which is what David himself wanted to actually do. And we see that things are going good until we get to the latter part of this first division. And you get to chapter 11 and you see Solomon's built the temple. Solomon's built houses for himself. Solomon has done all these things. And then suddenly Solomon says, hey, I need wives. And he marries, and he marries, and he marries. And the Bible tells us that these wives, they pull his heart away from God. They turn his heart towards other gods, and suddenly Israel, which, is supposed to be God's chosen people, instead of worshiping God, what they're doing is they are following gods from Egypt, and they're following gods from Canaan, and they're following, all these other gods from these nations that God says, hey, have nothing to do with. Don't marry them. Don't follow them. Don't be friends with them. Have nothing to do with these people. Suddenly, they're worshiping their gods. So we have a real problem here. And chapter 11 ends with Solomon dying. And basically, you see that it's given as a footnote. Solomon dies, his son takes his place, and God's ready to take the kingdom from the line of David. He rips it out of Rehoboam's hands, and he gives 10 of the tribes to Jeroboam. We'll talk about him in the later videos. And he basically, what he does is he says, hey, you didn't follow me, you lost the kingdom. So that's the general beginning to 1 Kings. Now, we need to look at all this in context. We need to actually take an opportunity to see what's taking place and where and what's going on here. In 1 Samuel, we see that the Israelite nation has said, hey, we want a God. We don't want to have God as our king. We want to serve a man just like all these other nations. And it's really unique. It's kind of funny, actually, because what we see is 1 Samuel begins with a mother or a woman who wants to be a mother praying and going to God and saying, hey, I want a son. I love you, God. Provide, take care of me. And 1 Samuel begins with life. Samuel is born. 1 Kings begins with death. And we see that transition. We see how there's going to be this disaster. It's not the, joyful book. It's not something that really shows us or gives us, hope. In fact, 1 Kings and 2 Kings are devoid of a lot of hope, because every time we see that God's people turn back to him, well, the next king pulls them right back away. In fact, when you look at 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll notice that it is divided up between the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. There's about 20 kings each. And in Israel, of those 20 kings, not one king is said to have followed after God. In Judah, 8 follow after God. That leaves 12 kings that don't. And, that really sums up the history of Israel. That sums up what we're looking at and what we're going to be studying over these next few weeks, basically, is Israel turning from God. So, 1 Samuel. Go ahead and bring it all together. 1 Samuel. We want a king. 2 Samuel. They rise up, they have Saul. Saul does really good, and then Saul doesn't. He turns from God. He makes a sacrifice when he's not supposed to. God says, I'm taking the kingdom from you, and I'm going to give it to David. And we see that David, is this man who is really humble. He won't raise his hand against Saul. He won't try to, do any of these things that Saul is just known for. Saul is, arrogant. He's ruthless. He's filled with vengeance and hatred. And, we see that David's the opposite of that. On 2 occasions, he has the opportunity to kill Saul and he won't do it. Well, 2 Samuel begins and we see that David is king, that Saul and his son Jonathan have died in battle. It was a tragic battle. And David is really upset. He mourns for his beloved friend, Jonathan. And he mourns for the king that he served. And, he has that great poem at the beginning of 2 Samuel where he talks about the great loss it is for Israel. And we see that David, he goes through and he makes himself king. God has done this for him. He blesses him. He gives him everything that he needs. And David becomes king. Things go great. David fights the battles that he needs to fight. David turns to God. He brings Israel closer to God. And we see this really beautiful moment where David says, hey, I have a house. I have a great palace, but God, you don't. You don't have this palace. You don't have, a temple in which you can dwell. And he says, I want to make you one. I want to build you one. And God looks at him and says, you know what? I appreciate that, but that's not what I want. That's not what I want from you. And instead, in chapter 7, God makes this promise to David that he's going to establish his kingdom forever. And it's the messianic promise. It's the promise of Christ to come through the line of David. And, we have this great hope. We looked at the period of the Judges. We saw how Israel, went up and down, up and down, up and down. It's just, it's tragic. It's horrible. I've told you before that the book of Judges is one of the most depressing books in the Bible because it is constantly filled with the failures of Israel. Then we get to this particular point, and God says, hey, look, I'm going to establish my throne forever. And then it all fails. David is given this promise, and you would think that would be enough. You would think that he would follow after God and live his life right, and things go that way for a little bit. But then chapter 11 of 2 Samuel, David is supposed to be at war, and instead he stays home, and we have the sin of Bathsheba. This is where things go wrong. And it is my opinion that this is the turning point, that this is where we first see the reality that the kingdom will split. David's sin, you read at what Nathan tells him in chapter 12, and you see that his household's going to be divided, that the sword is never going to leave his household, that, God is going to punish him for this. And you see that throughout the history. David's son Absalom rises up against him. Then you go a little bit further on in 1 Kings, chapter 1, you see that another son of his just basically says, okay, my dad's old. I'm going to take the kingdom. I'm going to be king. I'm king now. And David's alive. And his son basically tries to, again, steal the kingdom from him. So, 1 Samuel, we want a king. 2 Samuel, okay, God says, here's the king that I choose for you. Here's a king that, is after my own heart. And then that king, he fails. 1 Kings gives us a look of what desiring a king other than God results in. It results in captivity. it results in turning from God even further. Solomon, while an excellent king in terms of, you look at history, you look at the fact that Israel grew. I mean, if you go to your Bible, most Bibles, you open them up and they have maps in the back, and you can look and it will show you this chart, this idea of, okay, this is how big David's kingdom was, and this is how big Solomon's kingdom. You look at that, Solomon's kingdoms, it really grew. He was wealthy beyond measure. He, had all these people he brought in. The Bible talks to us about the sacrifices he makes. It talks to us about, the wealth he brought in. You get to Bathsheba, you get to the Queen of Sheba, and she comes in. This is this really high point in Solomon's life. I don't think we really emphasize that enough, but the Queen of Sheba comes in, and Solomon gives glory to God. She even says, hey, this shows that God is with Israel, and she brings gifts, and Solomon gives her whatever she wants. Basically, it's this really good testimony to the fact that other nations are looking at Israel and saying, hey, God is with them. But then we get to the death of Solomon, we see that all of that wasn't as rosy pink as we thought it was. The people are miserable. And they say, hey, ease the burden. Your father, he taxed us, he worked us to death. Ease the burden. So we see that Solomon was using slave labor. We see that Solomon was taxing the people, that everything that God said a king would do, he would take the best of your land, he would take the best of your fruits, he would take your sons and your daughters. Solomon did it. He was a king through and through, and the people at the end of his life, when his son comes up, they say, hey, it was too much. So when you take a king, when you turn from God, you're only going to go further down that path, because a king will do what a king wants. Solomon shows us that. Now, I firmly believe that the book of Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon. I believe that, you get to the end of that book and he talks about the whole duty of man being to, follow and to serve God. I think that at the end of his life, Solomon turns back. But the reality is, Solomon, his policies, his direction results in the kingdom that David built, a kingdom that his father did so much work to get and to grow. His life results in that kingdom being split in two. Now we will pick up in chapter 1 next week. We will look at what starts this, and hopefully as we go through this study, we'll understand that, there's a lot to learn here. There's a lot that we can use to avoid some of the same mistakes that Solomon makes. If you have any questions, again, I encourage you to leave comments in the box, and I'll be glad to get back with you on those questions and answer them. If there's anything else I can do for you, please feel free to send me a message. Thank you again for joining us.